Hey everybody, good morning, good evening, or what have you, wherever you may be in the world. I'll wait another minute or two before we get going.
Okay.
Paul, I'm glad to see you here.
Yeah, hi Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
Thanks for
Enjoying the
following
summertime.
along. It's a good opportunity to check that my audio is working for people as well, since I'm going to be presenting soon.
Yep, I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, that's great. Cool. Thank you.
So this is the week of the summit. I wonder if most people are there instead.
Yeah, I don't know. Good point.
I'm
It
not
is
I'm
for
not attending the summit. So
yeah. It does seem a bit light at this point. I know Thomas had something come up, so not the summit, that he couldn't come today. So I wasn't expecting to see Thomas here. It is almost 5 minutes after the hour, so I think we should get going. And we'll see if other people join. So today we have one agenda item that's been planned for a while, and that is Paul is going to share some thoughts, I think, about endorsement APIs and CoServe and et cetera. And we've had one topic come up in the last handful of days from Osama, specifically a question about the CCC attestation SIGs budgeting process, in particular about a request he has. So I think it sounds reasonable to insert Osama's topic briefly at the front here. In my head, I'm thinking of this as time box. If the conversation gets going, I'd probably request that we pause it and continue in a future time to make sure that Paul has ample time for his topic. So if that sounds good, Osama, do you want to present your topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really presentation, so everything is there in the issue. I have a couple of concerns. First being Verizon having its own funding as a CCC project. Why was the funding approved for that specific workshop? That's one concern. And the second one, I think the issue is, as per the instructions, I have filled it out. And my question specifically is that as per statements of the chair, it was not set in stone, that amount. And I would like to ask the next steps, like if I need, for instance, more than 500, how does the process actually work? Like, is it now, do I have to write like separately to the tag for, hey, I might get 500 from the SIG and please give me 400 extra for this? Or is it that I completely ask to them, the process is completely unclear on what are the next steps for that?
Yeah. I think all of us are a bit in uncharted territory. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So in the last 6 months, the SIG has learned that we have $2,000 per year that we can use for purposes, travel related expenses that make sense for topics related to what we work on here in the SIG. And so the chairs defined a process, put it on a wiki site, and the process basically is we'll approve reimbursement for up to $500 per event. The thinking being we're trying to encourage that $2,000 per year gets a chance to float around to a reasonable number of people in the SIG over a reasonable duration of time, since it has to, it's for an entire year. And Osama's coming with a question saying, hey, for a particular request that I just filed in the last week or so, I would like to go beyond that $500 to $900, and is asking, how can I do that? And we discussed this on March 11th, a very similar topic. And the discussion points that came up there, I think Keith said that apparently there was a previous way to request money from the TAC or something that didn't have limits. And so as far as anybody here in this SIG knew, that process was still in place, so that if something worked previously having nothing to do with requesting from this SIG, that should still be in place and still be accessible. And the other thing which you just mentioned, which was, we talked about the chairs set up this process. And
Greg,
yeah.
if I could briefly inject before we move to the second topic.
Mhm.
The process that was existing before, that was because of the reason that there was no funding, or we were at least not aware of the funding and whatever the process that was required for that. So now the funding exists. Even if I go to TAC, they will ask me, hey, what happened with that? So my question to you, and to also to other chairs, whoever are in the call, is specifically, now that the process exists, what do you propose? Like, do you have a strict limit of 500? Is that what you are saying? And would you consider that within that limit, or is it that I go to the TAC and say, hey, I need I would like to
I
have
think
like 900 at all?
I think our understanding, and so me personally, I have pretty much no understanding of the previous process. I've never requested money. I've never had any detailed exposure to it other than what's transpired in this SIG in the last handful of months. So I personally have no knowledge. So anybody who does, please feel free to jump in. I think where I best understand what was related in March, there was an existing process. Some people had apparently used it before. So, and it apparently had, didn't have a particular cap. So my suggestion would be, if you know of such a process, go try it out to see if you can get your $900. Or either way is fine. If you want to go for 500 here in this SIG and go for 400 there, or go for the full 900. I don't know which, since I'm not familiar with the other process, I can't, I have no advice there. I think for me personally, what's the thing I'm most interested in this forum here, which is everybody's time, right? We don't want to rob everybody's time for a particular thing we're trying to work out mechanically, is if folks in the SIG here today have thoughts on whether they, would suggest a different process in particular. Perhaps if they think it makes sense for a different amount, like not 500 per event, but maybe no limit, and let one particular entity take the whole budget on day one. I don't personally think that makes sense. I think where we landed on 4 makes sense, $400-$500 kind of distributions. But I'm not here to, I'm not a king. I'm here to try to help the group function and be fair and have a strong community. So I'm, if anybody in the call has any thoughts they want to share on what they think would make the most sense for how to distribute the money, the $2,000 over a year, I'd love to hear it.
Since nobody is speaking, I will repeat what I said in the call in March. I think 700 is a reasonable amount that 3 people can actually use. At least we can travel somewhere. So 500 is really something that from a procedural point, I have now double effort. First, I talk to the chairs of the SIC. Now I have to talk to the tech again, and it's an extra burden rather than a relief. It's an additional burden. So I'm really confused. What's the benefit of all of this?
So I think, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think now where this conversation stands in my mind, since nobody is participating but you and I at the moment, I think this conversation is probably best just moved to basically a sidebar where, you and the chairs discuss and kind of get straight. Does that sound reasonable? And we can take it off the plate for
Sure.
everybody to listen to?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, cool. So we have that email thread going, so we can continue there, Osama.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so next we have our topic for the day, and that's Paul is going to I think present some thoughts on endorsement APIs, and I'm very fascinated to hear the current thinking there. Paul, go ahead.
Okay, can I just check the screen sharing is coming through?
I see it.
Okay, that's cool.
A lot of blue.
Yes. Let me just check that I have the focus as well. Okay. It's working well enough. Okay. I think. Okay, so thanks. I'm Paul. I'm a senior principal software architect with ARM. This is going to be a presentation on a piece of work called CoServe. This stands for the Concise Selector for Endorsements and Reference Values. I'm going to talk about this as a piece of design work that we're progressing as an IETF draft. And I'm also going to talk about some proof of concept prototyping work that's taking place within the Verizon project. I should say at the outset, this was going to be a joint presentation between me and Thomas Fossati. Now, unfortunately, he's not able to be here for this session, but he has contributed a large amount of the work and the presentation material that I'm going to be sharing today. So I'll do my best to do it justice on my own. Presenting it for the first time by myself, I can't be entirely sure on timing. So can I suggest that if there are sort of deep questions and discussion points, we postpone them to the end of the material and then maybe future sessions if we need to. But I'm perfectly happy to be interrupted for sort of brief clarification questions. That's totally fine. So a bit of scene setting to begin with. This is all about the conveyance of endorsements and reference values to the verifier in the context of the RATS architecture that's set out in RFC 9334, likely to be familiar to people on this call. It's not just a theoretical model, it's shown to be a real industry requirement as well. There are services available today, examples being the NVIDIA RIM service and AMD's key distribution service. They solve somewhat different problems, but still within this general conveyance category. That's an illustrative list, by the way, certainly not an exhaustive one. Now, those existing solutions exhibit some fragmentation today. The APIs are proprietary. Data formats are certainly disjoint, if not necessarily proprietary. Now, you could argue that that's an acceptable level today, but the risk is that it gets worse, right? So endorsement providers and consumers become more numerous, as the general attestation footprint grows, either with confidential computing or other use cases. This could make it life hard for verifiers, in particular, because it's the verifiers that need to pull these data from across that diverse supply chain. So the question we're left with is, what more can we do to offer better guidance to the industry so we can hope for a future where there is this alignment and more standards and more common tooling. So I guess that is, if you like, the problem statement. I did a presentation to this forum last year on the same topic, hypothesized on what some of these improvements might look like and how we can use open source projects like Verizon to prove those out, and also make them available to the community in the form of working software. So today's presentation can be seen as an update on that. Incidentally, I am seeing some chat activity, but I'm not checking the chat. So Greg, maybe if you could, if you see any quick questions that I need to address sort of on the fly in the chat, could you?
Yes, I'll keep an eye there, Paul. Thanks.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Greg. Okay, so CoServe, what and why? So in trying to answer the question from the previous slide, various things that we could do and have talked about doing, right? In RATs, we have things like reference interaction models. We could enhance them. We could even have concrete API definitions in our design drafts in the form of open API specs. And I've been having conversations around some of these things, right, among various groups of people, but I think you could say we've landed on a baby step. So regardless of API and interaction model, there's got to be some kind of data format simply to facilitate the transaction, like a query response language, if you like, but not just any query response language, a query response language that is tailored towards the artifacts that the RATS model defines. So Thomas and I, between us, we felt that this was a nice, concrete, self-contained activity. We could write an IETF draft for a query language like this, and we could do some prototyping around the draft. Zama, I think you have a question?
Yeah, a clarification question, basically. You mentioned the reference interaction model, and I assume that's referring to the reference interaction model draft that is in the RATS working group, right?
Yes.
So my question here is, why does it need more reference interaction models? Are you saying that there is a need for, so why do the existing reference interaction models that draft is talking about insufficient for the purposes of endorsements? What exactly is that thing that is additionally required that is not covered by that draft for the case of evidence?
Well, yeah, you possibly answered the question yourself there, right? Because I mean, the interaction models are evidence focused, right? They are not endorsement focused, and also the idea here is that improving the reference interaction models or adding things to them is something that we have discussed but not actually done, right? So if you like, this is part of the motivational story for CoServe, because we landed on not changing the reference interaction models, or at least not yet, but instead focusing on a baby step.
I'm not sure if I understood that. So reference interaction model basically shouldn't care about what it is carrying, right? So it's a challenge, and for example, one of the interaction model is the challenge, right? So you send a challenge, it does something, it sends you back. Are you saying that there is something that's really different for endorsements compared to that for evidence?
Okay, again, I think I need to be clear, right? I am not making any such recommendation about changing the reference interaction model. I am saying that this is a thing that was discussed on the pathway to the piece of work that I'm now talking about. So really, this is scene setting, right? It's not. I'm not coming here with a specific proposal to say that there is any particular gap or inadequacy in the reference interaction models. I'm just saying that this was one of the things that was discussed along the pathway.
Okay, okay. I will wait till the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Okay, sure. So in any case, so that's, oh, Henk, sorry, you're next.
Yeah, just a quick addition. So what I heard is that you do not want to tie yourself to a specific interaction model. You want to have messages that hopefully in the end will be useful in all the interaction models, and tailor those accordingly. So you are basically API independent and thereby a little bit interaction model independent, but have the language for the query content. That's your concern. That you can find conceptual messages, and the starter set is endorsements and RVs, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Greg?
Yes, thank you. And this is echoing, I think, a question that I asked in the endorsement workshop. And so I'm probing to see if any thinking is involved here. So it says a query response language. So endorsements are all endorsements that are interesting to a verifier are signed, right? They need to be to establish trust in them. So what is the thinking in terms of signatures for the response? Is it a signature for, oh, go on.
I think probably, just anticipating your question slightly there, Greg, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I do remember the previous discussions, right? Probably it would be best if I just progress through the material, which incorporates sort of the latest thinking around that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so that's how it landed on CoServe. So before I actually present the spec, as it were, so a few of the design principles that we followed, things like we wanted to decouple the message from the transport, so we could create something that could transact using different transports or interaction models like HTTP or CoAP, to Henk's point earlier. We wanted something that could be used either as a simple get me everything method, but also handling things like deltas or pub sub models, using the transport efficiently, so something that suits either client-side or server-side caching, and also supporting verifiers that might be running on constrained nodes. So optimizing the data volume and minimizing, as far as possible, the client-side processing burden. And we wanted to specialize this for RATs, and not have it be too arbitrary or general purpose, right? We want it to be general purpose enough, but still being focused on the conveyance of endorsed values, reference values, and trust anchors. And using those existing RATs designs where possible, of course. Now, part of that means aligning to a CDDL data model, but the reuse is more extensive than that, as you'll see as I go through. And finally, we wanted to support flexible models of distribution with flexible models of trust. So CoServe design supports the concept of aggregation, where a distributor could gather together and sign off on a holistic description of an endorsed system, based on fragments coming from upstream supply chain actors. Now, the consumer of those aggregations then decides whether to trust them as it finds them, or whether it needs to probe deeper and go and audit the aggregation process and verify all of the inputs and all of the individual contributions into that process. So now I do need to stress at this point that we want to support that kind of model, but CoServe does not require or implement that model, right? It's just a space that we have in its design, so that we could do that. CoServe, first and foremost, is aiming simply to harmonize the distribution process across the multi-vendor space, right? So common conveyance is what CoServe is about, but we do want flexible conveyance as well. And why does that matter? This picture here is basically all that RATS has to say about the conveyance of endorsements and reference values to the verifier. It's totally agnostic about the real world logistics of that problem. It's agnostic even with respect to whether the conveyance is, say, like a push or a pull, or whether it's some ongoing synchronization mechanism. Now, of course, it could be any of those things, so we need that agnosticism in the model. But with CoServe, we're trying to cater for some of those real-world logistics, right, so that it can be pragmatically useful as part of a. And here's one example of what such a real deployment might look like. Now, I stress that it is an example. It's not a prescriptive model, right? Because CoServe is not about that. But this shows a case where there is a singleton verifier that wants to gather endorsements and reference values for a complete aggregated system. So this would be an attester that's made up of silicon, say, from multiple chip vendors, in turn integrated by ODM to create a device which then has workloads running on it, and those workloads are contributed by a different entity entirely. So this is where you might have the aggregation model in play. But what we have done, Greg, to your question, since the last time we did a presentation on this, is we've now actually built that kind of deep audit model into the design as well. So that's actually documented in the latest version of the draft. We revved the IETF draft last week, so it's worth reading the newest version. But the ability to preserve all of those primary materials along with their signatures, as well as having a signature on the aggregated result, is now catered for. We always aimed to do it, but the last time we spoke, we had not done it yet, but that has now been incorporated into the design.
Cool, thanks. I think there's one more hidden question.
Sure.
And is the response, so basically the verifier here has to trust the response. And so is whether it's done by an aggregator or not, is the response always signed, or
Yes.
is this okay?
Yes.
So that never says I defer to the channel, and you just, you get your trust by establishing a trusted channel, then whatever we send you, you just trust because of that.
That's right. Yes, you always trust the provider of your CoServe results, but then it's a decision as to whether you only trust that, or whether you also then need to probe deeper and audit the source materials.
And as you said, the response is always signed.
Yes.
By the CoServe. Okay.
Yes. Usama?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand one thing, and the second part is related to another draft. The first thing is, what does ODM represent?
That's just original device manufacturer, I think. So this is a systems integrator who is combining hardware pieces to create a device or a computing environment.
So is it something like I'm trying to think of it like in more practical terms. So chip manufacturer A, can you give me maybe a practical example of what that would look like? I was first thinking about Intel and NVIDIA, but probably that's not the case here.
No, so the silicon providers are the A and the B in that picture, right? So imagine they are producing the chips are going into sockets on a board. The manufacturer of the board or the server or whatever it is the ODM. But I suggest, this is actually just illustrative. This is not part of the spec as such. This is just a bit of scene setting to try to imagine what kinds of systems might exist that require this kind of aggregated model.
Right, but I mean that there has to be some practical motivation as well. So
Yes.
anyway, so my second question is related to the verifier. There is a draft in the RATS that's basically talking about multi-verifier, and I wonder if that if you have the opinion by using this to say that a single aggregator could take care of all the verifications from different chip manufacturers. Is this what this
Well,
picture is trying to say?
So that's an interesting question. Actually, Thomas and I were chatting about exactly that just this morning, right? That there is overlap between the idea of multi-verifier and the idea of an aggregating endorser, right? Because in a way, you could consider those to be two alternative solutions to a similar problem. If you have if you have evidence that is composed of multiple pieces, then shipping those different pieces to different verifiers would be one way of dealing with that composition and that complexity. But another way of dealing with it would be to combine all of the endorsements and reference values into a cohesive system description at the endorser level, and then feed that to a verifier that can then deal with everything in one go. I think multi-verifier and this model are related to each other. I hope that they are complementary. I hope that they provide alternatives, I guess, into the design space rather than like compete or exclude each other.
Right, but the reason I was asking was if you say it's an alternative, I recall a statement made by one of the editors of that draft, and the statement was it is impossible, quote unquote, to do it this way. That's why I was wondering what's your kind of practical motivation for this, and to be explicit, that comes from your colleague Yogesh, that it's really impossible to do it this way, and we need multiple verifiers to do that.
Okay, well, I mean, I can go and check the text in the draft. I don't have that. I don't have the multi-verifier draft fully paged into my head right now, so I can go and check. And Yogesh and I sit in the same room, so we can have a conversation about making sure we're aligned on the messaging there. It may be impossible, right? It may sometimes be impossible, which is why I think having these alternative designs that you can choose from, I think is of value to the ecosystem rather than, we shouldn't necessarily view them as being competitors.
Okay, thanks.
But thank you for the question, because I had similar concerns, right? I was talking them over with Thomas this morning, right? This is something that we do need to be very conscious of, the overlap between this model and the multi-verifier model.
Yeah, just as a hint, there is actually another draft which is by Kathleen, and that is trying to solve a similar problem. So I think the three drafts need to coordinate in some way. So that would be very interesting.
Oh,
Thanks.
right. Okay. Yes. The third one I may not know, so do feel free to link me to that. Henk?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, I had to leave the room. I am a little bit confused by how attestation sets, which is about evidence creation, is related to this work. I mean, of course, it's RATs, so it's in the same domain, so that's how it's related. I get that. What is the exact relationship here?
Well, the relation.
I'm not following.
Okay.
Between Kathleen's attestation sets, which is now a different name. I forgot the name, although we created the name together. I thought that Kathleen's idea is about optimizing the amount of evidence in a TCB by having, I want to say, compliance checkers in the TCB, so you can haul off a yes and no, and understand what compliance has been checked, thereby minimizing evidence volume. I think that is, in a nutshell, what Kathleen wants to write. I'm not entirely sure she's writing that, but I think that is the goal. And therefore, my question: how is this related? I don't see that.
Okay, so I mean, it is possible that your confusion is caused by my loose source, my loose sort of language usage. I don't know, maybe whether I'm speaking colloquially about some things and you're interpreting them sort of more specifically. I'm really
Okay.
the relationship comes from the fact that evidence from the attester might have multiple pieces, because there could be evidence that comes directly from the root of trust in the silicon. There could be evidence that comes from an attached device. There could be evidence whose corresponding endorsements come from different supply chain actors.
Yes, and all these compliance checks are done on a tester in situ, so to speak. And the verifier will get you got this CIS compliance profile, and your tester in the TCB says, yes. I have no idea how you would need a quorum here. But maybe there's a need. I don't know. Maybe I'm not getting it. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm also not quite getting what you're not getting. So I think that we will have to punt to later. We can offline it, or if I manage to get through all the slides, we can maybe return to it. Okay, so I think I'm now actually getting on to the walkthrough of the spec. So just some summary details of what the data model looks like. So as we've said, its basic CoServe is basically a minimal query response language. It's optimized for the RATS architecture, or trying to be. So that's it. In its simplest terms, it's a self-contained CBOR data object. It can model a query for endorsements or reference values and an optional result set. So there's the CDL for the top level data structure. CoServe is profiled in the same way that EAT and CoRIM are profiled. So we're using that same extensibility mechanism, although we will need to exercise some prudent judgment over the use of profiles, so that we can have, obviously we want as many concepts as we possibly can have in the common model. Now, aside from the profile, the CoServe object is either just a query or it's a query and a response. Now, the idea with the dynamic here is that a CoServe distributor would receive the query from the consumer, populate the response, and send the combined query response pair object back to the consumer. And the reason why we adopt the model like this is that it allows the consumer to verify that the response is for the right query. And this becomes especially possible once you've wrapped the whole thing in, say, a COSE, in a COSE, and you've signed it, right? The consumer can check that the query matches the response set. So this simple model is the basic building block for what could become an endorsement distribution API, which, as we've said, could be defined using HTTP or CoAP or whatever. CoServe is only the data format, right? It's not the API itself. Drilling into what the query looks like, just concentrating on the salient points. So the query is basically stating what kind of endorsement artifact do I want as a consumer, and what attesting environments do I want them for? And do I want them presented as a collected or an aggregated set, or do I also want the original source artifact so that I can do the kind of deep audit that we talked about earlier? The artifact types that we model today, we have three. There are endorsed values, reference values, and trust anchors, because those are the things I think that can be said to be RATS native artifacts, if you like. By this I mean that they're either defined in RFC 9334 itself, or they're in some of the adjacent RFCs and drafts. The attesting environments are a little more interesting. So imagine I'm a verifier. I've received evidence from an attester, which could be something like an EAT token, for example. In requesting the endorsement artifacts from the CoServe endpoint, I need to be able to describe that environment of that attester. Now, it turns out that attester environments are already very well catered for in CoRIM's data model. So we just use that. So recall that we had a design goal to reuse the existing RATS pieces where possible. This is probably the biggest example of that, right? The CoServe borrows very, very heavily from CoRIM. So we can select by class, by individual attester instance, or by an attester group, something like an anonymity group, for example. And the data types for those three options, they come directly from CORIM's data model. Quick word then on how those selectors are combined. So I've got a couple of just illustrative examples here of how those selectors might be transformed into, say, SQL queries, for instance, just to emphasize the semantics in familiar relational database terms. So we can select by class, instance, or group, as I mentioned, but we can also select by multiples in each of those cases. So we can specify multiple classes, multiple instances, or multiple groups in a co-serve query. And this slide just points out that those are considered to be alternatives. So they have match any semantics, and therefore it's the Boolean OR operation to combine those alternatives. But for the specific case of selecting by class, the class itself can have multiple inner fields, right? CORIM classes are compound objects themselves. They're not just strings. So these have match all semantics, and hence the combination is a Boolean AND operation for those inner fields. Okay, and that's the query structure. Turning our attention to the result set. Three things in here. So first we have the actual result set itself. This is the data that the co-serve endpoint has collected as a result of executing the query against its own data stores. The second field is an expiry time. So co-serve endpoint is going to populate this field to instruct the consumer to consider the results to be valid only for that limited period of time, after which consumers must not consider the result to be valid and they would have to requery. And the third field is a container for the audit trail. So we have a bunch of CMW records, media type labeled blobs that contain the sources that we used to construct the result set. So again, consider that aggregation use case we talked about earlier. The result set could be an aggregated result set, in which case those source artifacts provide the original data that were used in the aggregation process in case the consumer wants to re-verify or check all of those individual pieces. The result set itself is expressed as CORIM triples. Again, we just directly ingest the CORIM data model here. We do also label each triple with one or more signing authorities. So this additional piece of data effectively turns the triples into quadruples. So we do use the term quads as a bit of colloquial shorthand for each entry in the result set. These signing authorities denote the supply chain actor or the chain of actors that are vouching for that specific triple or that specific result. Again, this is particularly of use when we have aggregation in play, and the artifacts might have flowed through multiple distributors before they finally arrived as results to this query. And again, note, we have the three RATs data types there, the reference values, endorsed values, and trust anchors. Drilling further down, so this is what an individual quad looks like. This is taking a reference value quad as an example. So you'll see in the CDDL here, that's exactly how I described. So it's a reference triple record, which comes directly from the CORIM data model, but we mix that with the chain of authorities that are vouching for that particular triple. And these are just modeled as crypto key, again, borrowing from CORIM. They're a general purpose way to identify a signer. So that's how we model one quad, and then a result set for reference values is just 0 more of those in an array. And that concludes the data model basics. And I think I can now progress to talk about the Verizon prototyping work. So this is some work that's in flight. Thomas would normally have presented on this section. He's leading this effort, but Greg, let me pause. You have a question.
It's I suspect I'm asking similar questions and the same question over and over with slightly different takes on it. In my head, there's a vast difference. There's at least two high-level scenarios. One scenario is I'm talking to I'm a verifier and I'm connected to an entity I expect is the authority for the endorsements. So I may be talking to AMD or a trusted aggregator or whatever, and I say, this is the detailed, reference values or, that I'm after, or endorsement series triples or something. And then I get back specifically that signed by, essentially the system I'm talking to. And that's what this is all kind of looking to me like. But there's another scenario that's essentially how we do things in Azure today, which is we have a caching system in the middle. And the caching system intentionally doesn't, it's basically a conduit. It doesn't have a key. It doesn't sign anything. It just caches things from AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, blah, blah, blah. And when a verifier says, hey, I'm interested in some endorsements, the answer is always, oh, I'm going to noodle through all my stuff and I'm going to give you the subset of all my signed documents from these other players and hand you the right set for your particular scenario. And does that work well with how this is? I mean, once you start going from triples to quads, it's like in my head, it's just like, oh, okay, this can't be the original. This is like something new. So is basically, is it possible using this to basically have, where would a caching server live in this world? Is it orthogonal to CoServe? It's upstream from CoServe, and that's now, because that's the questions I'm asking my caching service now. It's like, you have everything, and here's the subset I want, and I just need you to pass me the subset of signed docs versus create, a new doc with a new signature that I now have to go and verify.
Yeah. Okay. I think we might need to just so I can progress through the rest of today's material. I mean, I totally get your point, and yes, I sort of understood it before. Again, COSA, I did want to double stress at the beginning of the presentation. We really are aiming for two things with CoServe, right? The whole aggregation and packaging and convenient projection of endorsements that have been gathered together is something we want to support in this model, but not something we require. CoServe starts out live just trying to be a uniform way to get at this stuff. And the aggregation model is something we support in the design, but otherwise don't require. So I think what probably would be worthwhile is for us to have a look at your use case in particular, and see whether we can come up with example result sets or a case study or some use case analysis to see how good the fit is. And if it turns out the fit is not perfect, well, this is a young piece of design, right? So this is the time at which we want to be ingesting requirements and making sure we get that right. So we're absolutely sort of malleable in terms of considering changes.
I'm totally fine with taking, for discussing out of band in another forum, and I'm totally fine if the answer is that scenario is intentionally not part of what we're discussing here. But if there is an intention to either cover a caching only kind of provider of endorsements, or to think through how this plays in that sort of world, then I'm not quite seeing it at the moment. And like I said, I'm totally happy discussing it elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we are, as I say, we are still gathering requirements, right? And we are absolutely, this is a good time to be influencing things. None of this is set in stone yet. We're only at sort of version 0.2 of the draft or whatever. So yeah, I think we continue to work on this. Probably the way to do that would be to just raise an issue in the GitHub repo that homes the draft, so that we track it and keep it in focus.
I think you told me that last time. I apologize for being lazy. I'll file it away again.
Sure, no problem. Or if you like, I can raise it on your behalf, and I can link you to it so that you can tell whether you can keep me honest in terms of whether I've represented your views correctly.
I'd love it if you did that. It would save me some time. But I'll also put a note down here to add it to my queue.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so we do have some minutes left. Hopefully, I can sort of rattle through the prototyping piece, since this is a CCC meeting and Verizon's a CCC project. So Thomas is leading this effort. He would be a better expert to talk through this session. I will do it justice as best I can. So the first thing to say is that Verizon does have a rich history as a proving ground, I guess, as a learning platform for these RATS designs. Verizon was built as a verifier, of course, but it can be repurposed as an endorser or reference value provider with new API endpoints. And then if we transact CoServe over those endpoints, then it makes for a nice proof of concept. So Verizon, of course, already has the ability to ingest some of these artifacts from the supply chain, and it has the ability to store them internally in a database. Therefore, it could be used to distribute them as well. So that's the exercise we currently have in flight that Thomas is leading. Here's how it works. So the first thing we need is an API. So remember, CoServe is not an API. It's only the data format. The prototype API is just a simple request response over HTTP using the get verb. Because we're using get, it means there's no request body. So instead, we serialize the CoServe query directly into the URL in the outermost path segment. This allows for a query to act effectively as like a stable resource. So a query is CBOR, we can base64 encode that into the URL. CoServe requires that is done deterministically, which means it can canonically represent the artifact being queried, which in turn allows for straightforward caching using standard HTTP caching controls. The parameterized media type, that's just the CoServe profile. So that's the same as how you would write the media type for profile EAT or profiled CoRIM. The parameterization is important in Verizon because Verizon has a plugin architecture, and the profile string effectively identifies the plugin that should handle the query. If you work on Verizon at all, you'll recognize this pattern because it's exactly the same as how EAT profiles or CoRIM profiles are used to dispatch the plugins for scheme-specific functions in verification or provisioning. There's an example request. Notice it's a new endorsement distribution endpoint, which sits alongside the existing challenge response and endorsement provisioning endpoints that Verizon already has. The serialized query would be in there. Obviously, it's massively truncated in this example. The accept header is saying that the consumer is expecting CBOR encoded CoServe again of a specific profile. Example response, which includes some abbreviated CBOR diagramming for the CoServe object being returned. Notice the query is reflected back in the response as we've talked about, but the result set is also populated now, even though here it's only denoted as some braces with ellipsis. So the detail there has been left out, but that's where all of those quads and artifacts and original source artifacts would be bundled. Looking at how the API is plumbed and implemented through the various layers of Verizon. So this first part actually sets up the HTTP listener and the path routing for the new endorsement distribution v1 endpoint. The routing there for the CoServe endpoint is interesting because that actually specifies CoServe as a path layer, but then specifies that the rest of the path is the serialized query, and then the whole thing is scoped under the endorsement distribution v1 route. So that's how we actually surface the HTTP, or if you like, the publicly visible layer of this to the rest of the world. Now there's an internal layer to Verizon, which is summarized here. So VTS, that's pronounced Vitis usually, stands for Verizon's Trusted Services. So Verizon has its own internal gRPC protocol using protobuf messages. These are microservices that are internal to Verizon, not exposed directly to consumers. This slide shows the plumbing of the Vitis RPC message that would service a single CoServe query called get endorsements. So an endorsement query comes in and out, but populated with the result set as it comes out. So that's the protocol layer within the internals of Verizon, but still just an interface. You'll notice I haven't got to any implementation yet. The implementations are housed in plugins. Now we've already talked about plugins in Verizon. In the POC, we're establishing 2 modes of operation for plugins. These actually implement the execution and the result packaging of CoServe query. So we've got what's known as local mode, where Verizon's own internal data store is the source of the results. This is most like the traditional database query model, I guess, except that the queries are CoServe queries rather than, say, something like SQL. But we're also looking, in the POC at least, supporting a proxy mode where we can play around with compatibility to CoServe. So Verizon's CoServe endpoint can then be used as a proxy, a compatibility layer for some other kind of endorsement service that doesn't speak CoServe. So these plugins would not consult Verizon's internal data stores, but instead they would go off and make a remote API call to some other service that's sitting out on the internet, like the NVIDIA RIM service, for example, or AMD key distribution service. This is just so we can experiment with using Verizon as a CoServe enlightened front end for services like that, just to see what the matching looks like, and then we'd write a proxy plugin to do that job. I think I'm running out of time, so I might have to race through. The slides are shared, of course, so you can go and investigate these sequence diagrams, but this is basically showing in sequence diagram form what I've just described, how the local operation would work relative to the internal data store, whereas the proxy version works on essentially a pass-through basis where the plugin just goes and negotiates the proprietary API with the external service to go and get the details and then co-servify them and convert them and send them back to the consumer. And some to-dos, I'll quickly race through these. We don't have any example proxy plugins yet, but that's actually something that I'm working on. Obviously, the spec is evolving, so we have to keep up to date with the latest developments. I don't think we've dealt with HTTP caching control yet, nor have we exemplified wrapping the CoServe response into a signed COSE envelope. And I will close with the references. So these are hyperlinks that you can use when you get the slides. So there is a Git reference that shows the deltas with the prototyping code, so adding CoServe to the CoRim library and also adding CoServe support to the Verizon services. And there is also a link there to the draft. And that's it.
Down to the second. I suspect that some questions. I suspect that folks may have some questions. It seemed a bit rushed there at the end. But by any chance, are you available in a couple of weeks to perhaps come back and in a calmer fashion, let folks, ask them questions and.
Actually, in a couple of weeks, I think actually we do this every 2 weeks, right? I think the next instance of the meeting, I'm not available on that day.
Okay.
However, it's possible that Thomas may be, although if he's chairing the meeting, I don't know if that works. But yes, certainly in principle, a future instance of the meeting, we could have a Q&A, a discussion focused around this topic. Yes, I am sorry for the lack of time for questions.
What does that make sense to other people? To circle back in 2 or 4 weeks and put aside a bit of time to refresh what was covered and do some questions. See a thumbs up from at least 2 people. So I think that's a resounding yes. So I'll coordinate with you and Thomas, and we'll figure out when it makes sense to circle back. All right.
Sure.
We are out of time. We are out of time, folks. So thanks everybody for participating today. And thank you, Paul. That was once again very enlightening and a very exciting space. So
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me. Okay, take care, everyone.
take care,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.